All right, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Board of Education meeting of the South Country Central School District. We are going to call the meeting to order and rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. Mr. Barry, would you lead us in the pledge,
I
please?
would love to. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Just a reminder of the emergency exits that are located directly to the rear of the building and to my right and to the audience left. In the event of an emergency, please exit through those passageway calmly and safely and in an orderly fashion. This is a smoke-free school district. Smoking is not permitted in the building or anywhere on the school grounds. This is also a hate-free and a bully-free school district. So as we begin tonight, just to let everyone know how the order of business for tonight, we have one item of business that we have to discuss and vote on. And then we will go into the superintendent's budget presentation. After that, we will take a motion to go into executive session. And executive session will conclude without reopening the meeting, coming back to the meeting, as there'll be no further business to discuss. The reason we'll be going into executive session is to take advice of counsel with reference to negotiations. So we'll start by first item B1, the benefits agreement that is before you. Is there any, I need a motion and a second to approve, and then we'll call for discussion. Is there a motion and a second to, motion by trustee Barry, seconded by trustee Kavanaugh? Any discussion? Seeing no discussion, all those in favor of item B1, please raise your hands. Thank you. All are in favor with one absence. And then next for our agenda for tonight will be the review of the budget process and the long-term planning for the 2023-2024 school year. Sounds like a long way off, but here we are.
Here we are. We're almost at the end of January. Thank you, President Felice. I also want to say publicly to trustees again, we apologize for the technical difficulties from last week. We felt it was important that we have this presentation done, given the community who could not be here personally, the ability to watch it live. So we're going to get right to it. I'm going to move to the podium. I'm also going to postpone my superintendent's report to our next meeting because it's scheduled for a regular start time, and I want to make sure I maximize our audience. I'm going to move over to the podium, and I will present from there. Trying to do a full screen with the screen. So thank you. I've anticipated this moment for a long time. In fact, I remember when I first submitted my application to work here in South Country on February 4th of last year. One of the things I started anticipating and looking ahead to our budget presentation. So I'm glad it's finally here. I'm excited about it. I also want to give credit to our business official, Jennifer Segee. I don't want to take any credit from for the content. The content was really developed in collaboration with a lot of people, but primarily from Jennifer Segee. And because it's a superintendent's budget that's presented to the board, I just thought it would be appropriate for me to present it. It gives me an opportunity to kind of speak to it. And I'm going to ask the trustees for the courtesy of asking all questions at the end of the presentation so that we don't disrupt the flow. We can always go back and refer to slides if there are specific questions regarding a specific slide. So at this time, I want to thank Jennifer again for her help, Ms. Segee, and we're going to get right to it. So basically, I wanted to start by reviewing our board priorities. And basically, the board operates under these 6 priorities that range from providing a safe learning environment for our students to recruiting and training great employees for our school district. But really, what I think is one of the most impactful priorities for a school board is the 6th priority, which is to develop a fiscally responsible and transparent budget, maximizing efficiency and economy, ensuring the district is using its resources to deliver the best educational program, and meeting our long-range planning goals. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. The reason I say it's most impactful because it really involves the public, it involves taxpayer money, And while we are in the business of learning and teaching, I do think the budget process is extremely important. So I wanted to discuss first some of the administrative considerations. While the Board of Trustees works under these priorities, the administrative team has to consider certain variables when we develop a school budget, and I want to kind of summarize those for the trustees and for the public. First and foremost, we want to make sure that our budget process is aligned with the board priority, which means we want to, engage in a transparent and responsible budget process. That goes without saying. Bless you. Second, we appreciate that public schools are in large part funded by taxpayer dollars, and if history has taught us anything, we know how we feel about taxes. So we want to make sure we do our due diligence and we prepare our budget to make sure we are efficient and that we really plan for unforeseen contingencies. So when we talk about a budget, we talk about a tool. A budget is a tool that helps us plan for the operation of the school year and a subsequent school year. The budget is not an exact number, so if your budget calls for $100, the idea is once you adopt a budget is you want to be as efficient as possible. So obviously you don't surpass what you budgeted, but you also come within a reasonable range so that you can plan for contingencies. So I wanted to kind of make the emphasis that the budget we aren't talking about actual numbers or exact numbers, but rather a tool that we use to sort of predict what our costs will be in relation to our expenditures so that we can operate our programs in a very efficient manner. Another consideration we make as administrators is distinguishing between wants and needs. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the budget process, but basically our job is to really sort of filter out what are needs for the district, things that must happen. Sometimes those things are there's an urgency to them, and things that are wants. That may be a good idea, but lack that urgency and something that maybe we could kind of postpone to a later date when we're planning in a very efficient manner. So again, it's about collaborating with stakeholders. They give us information. I'll talk about that a little bit more. But again, distinguishing between wants and needs. Fifth, we have to appreciate both the short-term and long-term costs associated with programs and staffing. Sometimes we live in a fiscal year, but when you do engage in a budget process, you can't just consider that one fiscal year. You have to look long-term and see what the costs and benefits to a school district will be, not just in the short term, but in the long term. And again, the focus is always on decreasing expenditures, which is the money that the school district spends and costs, and increasing revenues. And when we say increasing revenues, it's not just so much in terms of increasing budgets, but looking for supplemental revenue sources from donations, through our advocacy, through elected officials, through grants. There are other revenue sources that we can seek out that work outside of what we budget. And that's something we always consider and work towards. And finally, through transparent budgeting, we want to earn the confidence of the board and the trust of our community. And I think that's paramount. So as we move forward through this process, that's a pretty long process, I'm hoping most of all to accomplish that. Throughout the budget process, we use various resources. Again, I don't want the board to think that we work in a vacuum. We don't. We have a lot of resources at our disposal to help us in our planning. First and foremost, we have our internal auditors, Naraki Smith. They basically look at all our internal practices to make sure we're operating in an efficient manner, looking for efficiencies and those types of things. We also have external auditors, Cullen and Danowski, that look at our financial statements to make sure things are copacetic and good. I do want to take this opportunity to really give credit to our business office that has been rated really well by both agencies in the last few years for really sticking to our protocols and processes in our business office. And I also want to mention to the trustees and in public that for almost half a year now, we've been working with about 50% of a business office staff. And this is not a reflection of the school district, it's more a reflection of cyber attacks on civil service and just the time it took to replace some of our personnel. But they've been doing a fantastic job in keeping us up to date with payroll, accounts payable, so I didn't want to give them that credit in this public setting. Aside from our auditors, we also have financial advisors. We contracted with a new set of financial advisors over the summer. These are Fiscal Advisors and Market Incorporated. They've been a great resource in troubleshooting questions and just in terms of our planning and understanding where the district lies in terms of our financial status. We reach out to experienced superintendents through NISCUS, which is the New York State Council of School Superintendents, the Suffolk County School Superintendents Association, and of course Eastern Suffolk BOCES. All of these agencies provide support to myself as a superintendent. I have a mentor, I have a coach, and we routinely call each other when we have questions or we need help figuring things out. There's something to be said about experience, and so we are not shy, and we certainly reach out to our colleagues in other school districts and actually across the state. It's not just limited to Long Island when we have questions. The same could be said for our business official, Ms. Agee, who works through the Association of School Business Officials, that's ASBO, and Eastern Suffolk BOCES, and also through NISCUS by providing coaches and just resources for us to reach out to should we have questions and to help with regards to the budget process and planning. We have stakeholder input, of course, which is extremely important. That comes from our staff. Community input that oftentimes comes by virtue of the board acting as a liaison between the community and the school district, which is really important. And that type of input helps us make decisions on our program, our wants and needs, concerns, because again, when you're putting together a budget, you have to have all these contingencies in mind, and input is incredibly important. And finally, we rely on technology and software. We actually updated the software that we use to sort of make some of our predictions, because we want to make sure we're up to date and we use all our resources, even resources from the digital world that we're using and implementing here in South Country. So that's basically kind of a synopsis of all the resources we use to sort of make decisions in terms of our budget process. I also wanted to share our budget schedule. The budget process takes several months, and it begins in January with the first review of the budget process and our long-term planning, which we're doing tonight. In February, we'll be talking about, which is next week, our tax cap and budget expenses and review overview. February, we talk about specific lines in our budget that have to do with general support, as you see displayed, transportation, employee benefits. March, we'll have a presentation on our curricular programs and instruction. We'll do our staffing updates in March as well. In April, we'll have an update on expenses and revenue. And you notice this happens in revenue because, for example, the state hasn't put out their budget yet. So we don't know what our state aid is going to be at this present time and moment. So we can't answer questions with regards to that component of our revenue sources. So that's why we revisit that kind of component in April when we have a better idea and we have actual numbers. For next week's presentations, we'll talk in generalities. We expect the governor's budget to be released. This is just hearsay, February 1st. I think that's the deadline for the governor. And then after that is when we start making our calculations, etc. But this all culminates in April with the adoption of our budget, or my proposed budget to the board, and obviously in May, we'll host a budget hearing on May 3rd, and then on May 16th, we'll have our budget vote and board election. So that's basically the schedule of the budget process for the upcoming year. And to get a little bit more specific so that the board appreciates the sort of the mechanisms and the thought processes that occur through this timeline. Back in November and December, we initiated conversations with administrators to just talk about sort of the structural part of our budget process and talk about expectations, procedures, and considerations. Also in December, we provided some training to our administrative team and clerical so they can use new software. We eliminated a couple of steps that we felt were inefficient in terms of developing budgets and submitting budget proposals. So what we're doing now is actually submitting their proposals right into our accounting software, which eliminates a lot of steps and also eliminates the potential for mistakes when you're transferring data from spreadsheets, for example, to our business software. So it's a lot more efficient. And what's amazing, in this initial year, it required some training and extra work, but in subsequent years, you'll be able to refer to the prior year's budget and budget proposals right within the system. So it just makes it a lot more efficient for us. In January, the building department budgets, staffing tables, new and special program requests are submitted to the district office, and we start reviewing those proposals as a cabinet here at district office, engaging in conversations with our administrative teams. Some curriculum items will come from our directors, some building requests will come from our principals, but the idea is to sort of go over all those things and sort of get sort of an idea of what we're looking at in terms of our planning. At this point in January, it's impossible to predict staffing needs because there's still processes that need to happen, as you will see. Excuse me. That process pretty much starts in February, where we start counting FTEs. If you're not familiar, FTE is a full-time equivalent, it's a full-time teacher or full-time staff member. So those staffing requests begin to come in during February, but they're not yet accurate because there's a couple of variables that we need to consider before we finalize what we think our staffing needs will be. And again, I want to emphasize that we focus on needs and not always on wants. And if we have room in the budget and we feel that there's something we can accommodate, then certainly we're welcome to new ideas and suggestions. But really, the idea is to focus on our needs first. In March, we have our staffing requests are verified through projected enrollment. That's more applicable for our elementary and middle schools because basically our staffing is basically a direct correlation to enrollment. So if you have an elementary school with 100 kids and our average class size ideally would be 18 or let's say 20 because the math is easier, then you're going to need 5 teachers. So that's how enrollment kind of plays. And then you have to look at specials and those types of things. But that is basically calculated primarily on enrollment. Secondary schools, especially the high school, is somewhat different. Staffing is developed based on student requests and course requests. And that changes year after year because we engage in individualized scheduling. So kids or students submit their course request, we tally up the request, and you make estimates of how many sections of each course you need to run. So using the 20 class size average, and that's not an accurate number, it's just easy for me to do the math using the number 20. If we have 100 students request biology, then you know you have to run 5 sections of biology. And just to go back to FTEs, a biology class, because that's a lab component, is a 0.3 FTE cost to the school district. Classes that meet on a daily basis in a high school are 0.2s. Teachers typically teach 5 periods, that equals 1.0. A class that has a lab that meets on alternating days is a 0.3 because you have a class every day, 0.2, every other day is 0.1, that's a 0.3. So a typical science teacher will have, not all science teachers will teach 3 Regents classes because they have a lab, or 3 sciences that have a lab component, that makes a 0.9, and then they'll have an elective, which is usually a semester, half a year, or a course that meets every other day, which is a 0.1, that's what makes them a 1.0. So for the high school, it's a little bit more complex because we have to look at course requests and we make the staffing determination based on those course requests. And you have to consider a lot of things. What's the likelihood that if 100 kids request biology, that 100 kids will fit biology in their schedules? So there's a lot of complicated sort of calculating that needs to happen on the high school's part in collaboration with us. In April, the school budget is finalized. That's when we kind of finalize our revenue and our expenditures. It's presented to the board, and then it's hopefully adopted after discussion. And then once again, once it's adopted, we have our budget hearing and our budget vote in May. So I just want to kind of articulate the process, beginning to end, and sort of all the things that we're going to be engaged in between now and May. So the budget process itself. Tonight's presentation is based on 2 components, the budget process itself and then long-term planning. And again, I want to emphasize that these are just generalities because we have yet to see what our revenue is going to be. Once that state budget comes out, we'll get hard to work and making those calculations. So first we have to decide on the budget strategy. A rollover budget basically is when you take 1 year's budget, you roll it over, and then you tweak it from there. So you almost like work backwards, assuming that nothing changes. Fixed cost budget, there are certain things that are fixed costs, like bond payments. We know what our bond payments are going to be for the next 5 years. Those are fixed costs. You basically roll those fixed costs over. A zero-based budget is basically you start from scratch, and the schools and the different entities in our school district basically decide, if I'm designing a school from scratch, here's my wants and needs, and then you build it from there, and the budget's totally based, starting at 0, and you build up to your final budget proposal, and each of our schools have a budget, our departments have budgets, and that's just a strategy. And a priority budget is different because it's sort of based on a zero-based budget, but you're looking at priorities. What are our priorities? What are our goals? And how does the budget meet the needs of those goals? And so basically you lay out recommendations and you cost out what it takes to reach certain objectives. What we engage in is basically a combination of all these strategies because, yes, in general terms, you kind of roll over a budget. You don't start from scratch. That would be too complicated a process, and we have a point of reference. There are certain things that are fixed costs, so of course those things just get transferred over to the subsequent year. And again, it's zero-based because our sort of message to our building administration, our administrative team is, tell us what you want. You know, a student once told me in my prior high school, if you don't ask, the answer is always no. So, and that was sage advice. So again, tell me what you really want, and then we start sort of like discussing it, and then we try to filter out again wants and needs. And if we can make it happen, if it's really a need, then we're gonna do our due diligence to make sure we find a way to make it fit in our budget. And so that's kind of sort of our mindset right now. So again, our budget process considers all these strategies, and of course, we have to gather information. We have to gather information based on revenue and expenditures, our actual versus budgeted. And what that means is if I budgeted $100 for my biology class, I'll keep using that example, and I only spent 90, then you have to say, how much do I budget for the subsequent year? And again, you always want to budget for unforeseen circumstances. So the budget is not an exact number. It never is. It's a tool we use to help guide us in the operation of the school district throughout the fiscal year. Again, we gather information in terms of program needs, staffing, equipment, supplies. You know, if someone's proposing a new course or we want to enhance a course, maybe there's costs associated with supplies that are specific to that course or equipment, etc. We need to project revenue and our expenditures and gather that information. Like I said, as soon as the governor's budget is released, that process starts pretty quickly. We have to calculate a tax levy. A lot of people confuse the tax levy with the tax cap. I have a different slide kind of explaining the difference. But next week we'll talk about the tax levy. And so that's something that needs to be calculated using an 8-step formula. It's pretty complex, and we'll go into that formula at our next presentation. And finally, consult. You know, we don't want to work in a vacuum. I certainly don't know everything, nor does Jennifer Segee, so we reach out and we consult because we want to make sure we're making informed decisions. And so that's basically the budget process in a nutshell. We have an idea of what our schedule is, some of the activities we're going to be engaged in the next couple of months, and this is basically our strategy and how we gather information. Next, I want to talk about, one more step, and of course we propose the budget to the Board of Trustees throughout this process, which culminates again in April with the budget proposal and adoption and our vote in May. Next, I want to talk about long-term planning. And when we discussed how best to introduce long-term planning, we thought that the best sort of graphic depiction would be a roller coaster. If you look at school districts and school budgets over a 20, 30-year span, you'll see there are going to be peaks and valleys. The idea is to never have consecutive years where you're going down into a valley. And it's almost impossible to have consecutive years where you're going up to a peak. The idea is you kind of balance the two. The reason you go up and down when it comes to school budgets is because there's so many variables that are out of our control. It all depends on our governor, state aid, federal aid, unforeseen circumstances that may happen. So a part of budgeting and long-term planning is appreciating the fact that there are going to be peaks and valleys in a school district's history. And it's how best you navigate that, and how best you navigate the district when it's in a peak, so you don't overuse or overspend, being mindful and always being careful about how we spend, and how we navigate those valleys so that we could come out of it as expeditiously as possible. So I like this sort of graphic because, again, it kind of depicts how budgets work if you look at it, a trajectory over the course of several years. So here are the challenges that we have as a school district, and some challenges are just universal to all school districts and to actually New York State. The first challenge is inflation and the tax cap calculation, or our tax levy. I have another slide kind of explaining why that's a challenge. This challenge here is universal, because I think we're all sort of aware that inflation is pretty sky high now, and I'm going to talk to the board and to the public about how that kind of affects this calculation. Our federal grants period end date. We had federal grants that came to us as a result of the pandemic. Those grants will end at the end of the next school year. And then finally, and again, these two challenges are not unique to us. Those are basically universal challenges faced. The first challenge faced by school districts. The second challenge basically faced by a lot of municipalities and school districts and governments, all of which receive these rescue funds that are going to run out in 2024. And finally, our challenge that's unique to South Country is the differential in building, which is our state aid, and our bond payments, which is another challenge that's unique to us, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a future slide. And I'm going to start with inflation and the tax cap calculation. This graph basically depicts what inflation has been for the last 10 years. When the tax cap was adopted, I believe it was back in 2012, New York State came up with this number of 2%. The 2% was based loosely on inflation because inflation typically hovered around 2%. So the rationale, in my mind, was, hey, if inflation's around 2%, then we should allow school districts to roughly increase their budgets around 2% because of inflation and rising costs that are out of school district control. The tax cap was done for various reasons, but it was in part based on, the rate of inflation. And if you look in this graph, you see inflation typically hovers around 2%. Sometimes it's below 2%, sometimes it's just above. But if you focus your attention on 2021, where inflation was 7%, on 2022, where inflation was 6.5%, obviously that's going to impact school districts because costs are rising. And to be a little bit more specific, here's just a categorization of how inflation affects different products. But if you look at food, inflation rates for food over 10%, energy a little about 6.5%, and all else that affects schools and our budgeting. These things are out of our control. When the cost of supplies go up, we can't control that as a school district, so we have to kind of plan for it. So that's like one of the challenges when you have to sort of adhere to a tax cap that doesn't really align with the rate of inflation and the cost of living. And again, this is a universal kind of challenge. The next challenge is the federal grant period end date. This is basically the three sets of grants we received and the schedule in which we received them. The first was the CRRSA, which was a Corona Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Grant, which basically has helped schools prevent, prepare for, and respond to the pandemic. Those funds were allocated for different reasons, but primarily in that first year is PPE equipment, any changes that school districts felt were necessary to sort of help support keeping students safe and preventing further spread. In the following year, we had the ARP and ESSER, which is the American Rescue Plan, and the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Funding, which was allocated to support the safe return to in-person instruction and the continuity of services. School districts got a lot of sort of leeway in terms of how those funds were used because we based it on specific needs, so they weren't so prescriptive. But the challenge is that after September 30th, 2024, New York State and school districts are facing this potential funding cliff for the end of these grants. To kind of summarize the amounts of revenue we received from the grants over the last 3 years, you see in the 21-22 school year, the school district received $2 million in total. For the 2022-23 school year, about $6.5 million, and then $4.4 million for the next year. And that's when the allocations of the grants end, for a total of about $12.8 million. Now, these grants weren't just given to school districts and they say, hey, decide, do what you do or make any decision. South Country is required to submit a comprehensive spending plan to New York State, which we reviewed and approved, and it's on our district website. We used some of the grant allocations to offset COVID-related expenditures, therefore in directly kind of reducing our expenditures. And we plan on doing the same for this current school year, and we are, and for the subsequent school year in a manner that's not going to adversely affect the school year, and we're going to be prepared for the ending of these funds. But that's basically a summary of the funds we received over the last 3 years, or will receive at the end, by the end of the term, which is September 30th, 2024. More specifically, in looking forward, the next challenge to be met is basically the differential in our bond payments and building and state aid, which again was probably a huge challenge for us to even think about and really try to figure out a plan and how to mitigate the differential. As you can see, there's a differential in our current year of about $3.5 million, if I just estimate it up. And in the worst case scenario in these differentials will be in the 25-26 school year and the 26-27 school year. Those numbers, if you look at them on their face, seem really alarming, and they are challenging, but there are different things we can do to mitigate those challenges. Again, it comes with careful planning. So here's some of the things that we're projecting in terms of our long-term planning. First, ongoing review of our programs to reduce expenditures. even if we didn't have these challenges ahead of us, we would still be looking to reduce expenditures. That's just the normal mindset of the budget process. Anywhere you can save, you save. Second, we look at the use of attrition. A huge component of school budgets are salaries. So as people retire, you really look at their positions, and if there are things that you don't necessarily have to replace, you make those decisions. But attrition sometimes is a natural way of reducing expenditures for a school budget. And so we look at, and certainly over the next 5 years, we want to be very mindful of that. One of the things that's sort of an indirect sort of strategy to mitigate this differential is to engage in ongoing capital improvement projects which generate revenue in building aid at a percentage of 76.2% in reimbursement rate. So what does that mean? Because it's sort of counterintuitive. Wait, we're going to spend money to create revenue? Well, New York State school districts, when they engage in state-approved capital improvement projects, school districts get approved for it. Get reimbursed for it at different rates. The rate for South Country is 76.2%. Capital improvements are good, first and foremost, because our facilities need it. Anyone who's a homeowner knows if you spend 10, 15 years and you don't make improvements in your home, things start falling apart. So first and foremost, we don't engage in capital improvement projects to generate revenue. We do it because our buildings need it. And again, capital improvement projects should be ongoing, not so much from this sort of side of the argument, but because the buildings need it and we have to continually improve our facilities. But it also generates revenue. Different ways you can engage in capital improvements is number one, a capital reserve vote. We had one in October that passed. That will engage in $2.6 million worth of capital work, which will be reimbursed at that 76.2% reimbursement rate. I want to make it clear that that reimbursement isn't a one-shot payment. It comes after the school district spends the money and completes projects, and the reimbursement is spread over 15 years. But again, it's 15 years of continual revenue in the form of building aid. We're also looking at engaging in an energy performance contract, which is estimated at about $5.6 million. We had a presentation before the board a few weeks ago in the public. This is a budget neutral mechanism that school districts use to engage in capital improvements. What that means is, and I'm going to surmise, and I don't work for Energia, which is a company that we're collaborating with, is the company basically guarantees a certain amount of savings. When they made an initial assessment of our energy cost, they basically estimated we'd be saving about 20% of our energy costs up to 30%, which amounted to about $5.6 million over a course of certain years. Those savings is what's used to pay for the improvements or the capital projects. If we don't achieve the savings that they guarantee, the contractors literally cut the school district a check to make up the difference. So it's almost like a no-brainer. The one thing I do want to point out is the reimbursement rate for energy performance contracts is not 76.2%, but 66%. But it's still incredibly beneficial to the school districts. So two ongoing things that we're doing currently to sort of engage in capital improvements. Another thing we're considering is having a capital transfer budget line. Some school districts will have this capital transfer budget line within their budget, which allows the school district to engage in capital improvements on an annual basis based on the needs of our facilities. This does not require a public vote. And typically these budget lines aren't so astronomical. For argument's sake, let's say we had a budget line of $1 million for capital improvements, which for any normal person, $1 million sounds like a lot. But when you talk about school projects, it's actually not a monumental amount of money. But again, if you're engaging on an annual basis in $1 million worth of capital improvements and continually improving our facilities, then theoretically speaking, you're going to continually create revenue sources in the form of building aid over the next 15 years, but also for the foreseeable future, because every year you're going to be adding more capital improvements. And again, we have to see whether or not we could fit a line like this in our budget, and we're hoping we can. And finally, it's future bond proposals, and I'm not suggesting that we engage in any bond proposals at the present moment, but it's something that we're going to have to consider for two reasons. Number one, we haven't engaged in real substantive capital improvements in this district for a number of years now, and our buildings certainly are going to start needing them. And I can argue that there are some needs that are existent right now. But one way of looking at it is to start thinking about bonds, not in terms of astronomical bonds, like an $80 million bond or a $100 million bond, but smaller bonds that you do every couple of years that really address real specific needs in our school district. So for argument's sake, you do a $20 million bond that will address, real things that obviously will take a process to identify. And then again, that bond will generate income for 15 years. And of course, we would finance it so that's aligned, so we don't have a mixed match in the future. But again, the idea is to generate that revenue for the foreseeable future while making improvements to our schools. So that's the kind of the capital improvement part of how we sort of mitigate this differential. And that's long-term planning. Ongoing exploration of alternative revenue sources, donations, grants. We have to do our due diligence to see what funds are out there, whether it's from private agencies, whether it's from elected officials that help supplement some of our expenditures. And that's always something that we work on, regardless of whether or not we have financial challenges. That's part of the normal process. And finally, strategic use of our reserves to the extent possible. And what I mean by extent possible is there are regulations and laws that kind of govern how schools use their reserves. And so we're talking about reserves. I kind of want to explain what they are for the benefit of the trustees and the public. A reserve fund is basically like a savings account. School districts are allowed to save some of the money from their budget into specific reserves to have specific purposes. The idea of having reserves is they are to be used when those unforeseeable circumstances happen. When there's something that happens that will necessitate the use of reserves. And again, for some of the reserves, you have to really use them for specific purposes. These are all the types of reserves that school districts are allowed to have. The ones highlighted in yellow are the ones that our district currently have. Our capital reserve fund, our LBAR fund, which is the Employee Benefit Accrued Liability Reserve Fund, our Retirement Contribution Reserve Fund, which has an offset with the TRS Retirement Contribution Reserve Fund, Unemployment, and Workers' Compensation Reserve Funds. These are all restricted. They can only be used for specific reasons. So those are the ones that we currently have. But there's other types of fund balances that we have after the budget season. So we just spoke about reserves, and again, all of those reserves that are restricted have to be used for specific purposes. Some, like the Capital Improvement Reserve Fund, requires a voter vote to be used, and that's what we did in October. The assigned fund balance includes the amount of monies that may be left over in a budget that could be appropriated partially to fund the subsequent school year. Those assigned fund balances can help lower the tax levy, meaning that the tax burden on our community will be less when we take those unassigned fund balance amounts and apply them to the subsequent school year. Unassigned fund balances are basically leftover money that can be used for any purpose. New York State allows school districts to have up to 4% of their budget reserved in an unassigned fund balance. That's a cap for all school districts. And there's current debate up in Albany whether or not they want to raise that 4%, but we'll see what happens. But right now, we work with the 4%. And the idea, again, and I want to emphasize this, is not to over budget or to budget to have reserves or to budget to have huge fund balances. But again, you develop a budget, and then throughout the course of the school year, you try to be as efficient as possible so that you do have funds at the end of the year that you can use to either fund our reserves or to assign fund balance or to have unassigned fund balance. Here is a summary of all of our reserves, and you can see sort of the trend from the last 5 years. Starting in 2018, we had about $25.4 million or $25.5 million that we estimate up in our reserves. And currently, as of June of 2022, we have $34.4 million in our reserves, which indicates that we've been sort of budgeting in a very appropriate way. I know the Board of Trustees voted to sort of fund our reserves, and we've been doing that. The $34 million is a pretty healthy number to have because we have funds available if called for to use to help mitigate things like sort of a differential between bond payments and state aid and some of the sort of challenges we have ahead. I also wanted to show this trend graphically here so you can see sort of the upswing starting in 2018 and how we've been able to fund our fund balances or our fund equity over the last 5 years, which is good for a district to do. But again, I want to talk about peaks and valleys because right now we're kind of at a peak with our funds. So Another way of looking at this graphically, I wanted to compare it and contrast it to our expenses and our revenue. Again, if you look at our expenses, they've been relatively flat, and I know those numbers are monumental, but it's been relatively flat, meaning that the school district has done a pretty good job in terms of keeping our expenditures at a pretty level place. And our revenue is going up a little bit more dramatically, but that's also due to some of the federal funds that we received over the last couple of years. When you look at flat expenditures, to a large part, not exactly, and a little bit more revenue, it makes sense that our reserves have been increasing over the last 5 years, which again is a good thing. But now let's look ahead at a 5-year projection. And I want to emphasize that all of our consultants, our financial advisors, said there is an inherent danger in projecting beyond 5 years. They also sort of recommend that we project 3 years because there's so many variables out of our control that can affect our budget process. Again, those variables include our state aid, different happenings. One of the things that we're not banking on, but I'll say it publicly, is, for example, our federal funds are set to end on, or that the CRISA and the ERSA funds set to end in 2024. That coincidentally coincides with a presidential election, and sometimes the federal government starts really assessing the situation. And I can argue, and a lot of educators will argue, that we're not beyond the effects of the pandemic. You know, when we talk about mental health concerns, when we talk about instructional gaps, there still needs to be a lot of support. So again, this is not something we bank on, but this is one of the things that's unpredictable, where maybe the federal government will rise, these types of things that happen during election years, and where the federal government will say, hey, you know what? Schools need some more funding, we're gonna help them out. Again, we don't bank on that in our long-term planning or in our budget process, but there's a lot of things that can happen between now and 5 years from now, 10 years from now. On the negative side of the argument, you have potential for recession, cost of living, inflation. On the other side, we could have an economic boom or something happens. There's a new technology. If we remember in the 90s, we had that economic boom. So it's hard to predict 10 years down the line. So we stuck to kind of 5 years. And the idea is that we won't be funding our reserves at the capacity we've been doing so in the last 5 years. We'll fund them less. And we'll use that money to, again, sort of cover some of that differential and some of our expenditures to help us get through this financial cliff as we've been talking about. Is it going to be easy? No. Is it going to be challenging? Yes. But we're up to the challenge. I think we'll get through it. I'm confident we'll get through it. There have been challenges that school districts have faced in the past when the state has decided to pull funds in the last minute. That's happened in the past. And somehow school districts always figure it out. And I know I get accused of being the perpetual optimist, but you know, this is also based on experience, and it's based on planning and really looking at every detail in our short-term planning, that's planning for the next school year, and of course being mindful of projections over the next 5 years. But that's basically where we're seeing our 5-year projection. And what's a school district's credit? Like, are we in a good place to like engage in these types of things? Well, I wanted to kind of share that with the board and with the public. If you look at our Moody rating or our S&P Fitch rating, we're rated as a AA under S&P Fitch, or AA2, which is basically rated as high quality and very low credit risk. This is a good position for a school district to be in. It's actually a great position for a school district to be in. So credit-wise, and this comes from our financial advisors, we have AA rating, which according to my financial advisor was excellent. Obviously the top rating is a AAA, but we're pretty much there. We also asked for a summary of our credit briefs and snapshot of district's current metrics, and they all are strong or good. And in the case where you see the overall net debt, having a low characterization is actually a good thing. So credit-wise and financially speaking, just to sort of re-emphasize what our external auditors said during their when they presented our financials, we're in a good place. That doesn't mean we don't have challenges ahead. It doesn't mean we don't have to be careful and really look at our budgeting process with a fine-tooth comb. But we're going to be in a position where we can meet these challenges while maintaining our programs. And that really is the goal of my cabinet, the Board of Trustees, and I think I can speak to you to that again, is how do we preserve our programs, how do we mitigate this differential, and how do we move forward. And finally, just to summarize, today we kind of gave a synopsis of our budget process and kind of our thinking in long-term planning. Again, we didn't use specific numbers because they're not available yet. We're waiting for the budgets to come out for the governor's office, our tax levy calculation, etc. Next week, on February 1st, next Wednesday, we'll talk about the tax cap and our budget expense and revenue overview, and then we'll be following that schedule moving forward. So I want to thank the board for this opportunity to present our first budget presentation on the budget process and long-term planning, and I want to open it up to questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Superintendent.
Yes.
You certainly were very comprehensive and thorough in your presentation, and I appreciate that. So why don't we start going around the table for anyone who had questions?
So I want to again emphasize that presentation was drafted by Business Official Mr. Gee. I just made it look pretty.
It's a team effort.
Yes, absolutely.
And
It's always a team.
That was evident. No, I have a number of comments, but I'd like to open
Sure.
it up to the Board of Education first. So who would like to begin? Anybody?
I'll begin.
Okay.
That's all right.
First,
You know, ultimately, I think that the attractive piece is that this is a level of consistency. I think that's important. Looking at the presentation in advance and what it is that you've presented here, to me, is in line with where we are and what we need to do. It's a great piece to represent to the community and get their feedback as well. And it's ultimately puts our district in the place where it properly is in order to prepare. So congratulations on everyone getting this together, keeping to the timetable except for the technical difficulties last week.
I appreciate that, Trustee Barry.
Trustee Kavanaugh, would you like to?
Yeah, I don't have a question yet, but I may be formulating one. I just think this was very helpful in understanding the process of formulating and building the budget. And I hope that it's going to be helpful to the members of the community who have tuned in or will watch the video of this. Because I think that in the past, it's been a little bit more, or a little bit less transparent. So just understanding the steps month by month as we go towards the May budget vote, I think it's going to be really important. I think this is a great laying of groundwork.
And one of the things we wanted the board to appreciate, the public to appreciate, that it is an ongoing process. Right? So we don't want to divulge information unless it's going to be accurate and transparent to your point. That information will be kind of released as it comes. And that's why I wanted to display the schedule. We wanted to display the schedule. So at least you have a sense of when this information will be coming. And so again, because I do want, one of the things I'll admit as someone who's watched budget presentations is sometimes I had a hard time following them. So as a former teacher and educator, one of our goals is to almost treat this as a teaching exercise. So that we don't only just go over what our budget will be and what our expenses will be, but we educate the trustee and the public at the same time.
Okay.
This actually helped me understand how the budget process works because I wasn't really sure, that sure about it. So I think this helped me a lot more than anything that I've heard before. So I thank you for that. Appreciate it. Well, thank you too.
Trustee Trent.
Yes, I have one question. Mr. Santana, can you go to page 18 for me, please? This slide here, are you able to tell me, absent the federal monies that we got, those 3 grants that you mentioned earlier, would the green line be above the blue line, or would it be similar to this graph here?
So this is based on actuals. Well, no, not this. This is a reflection, right?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. This is based on actuals, not budgeted. When you create a budget, the green and blue line have to be equal.
Okay.
Yeah. Because remember, the budget is a tool. So in order to present a budget, you have to present a balanced budget. So, Mr. Gee, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but yeah, the expenditures and the revenue have to be aligned.
But I believe that our budget was created after we got the federal money. So the budget was balanced
Right.
until COVID happened. And then we got the federal money. So it doesn't look balanced to me.
No, those are actuals.
That's actual.
Okay.
So you always want your revenue to be above the expenses, because otherwise we'd be in a deficit, we'd be in the red. So that's the actual money that was spent, not what was budgeted.
But our revenue is lifted up because of the federal money.
Correct.
So I want to know what it looked like absent of the federal money. if we didn't have the federal money.
Well, you incorporate the federal money into your budget.
Yeah, but what I'm
It's a
saying,
revenue source.
so I guess I'm asking the question because I don't wanna build a budget based off of money that isn't gonna be coming every year. The federal money
No, correct.
won't be coming every year.
No, that's absolutely correct. In fact, in 2024 is when those funds end, so that's not gonna be a revenue source for it. So we can't include that in the budget,
Yeah.
because it's not gonna be revenue. So for the, we'll still have some revenue for the 23-24 school year from federal funds, so it is gonna be included in our budget,
Okay.
but that's last year. The budget after that is not gonna have federal funds unless, like I said, there's something happens in the federal government, and during the presidential election, they decide to give us some more funds. But we can't include money that, and that's what, and so when we make projections and we start looking, we don't count the federal funds. You can't count something that's not gonna be there. And that's when I say we don't bank on it, and we don't bank on like federal funds coming again or another round of help or supplemental income. You can't do that. That's just me speculating that they may happen. And that's why you do a budget on a year-to-year basis, because you have to use actual revenue,
Yeah,
not what you might think happened.
okay. So the money that we, are spending the federal money on now, and in the years while we have it, once the federal money is gone, we're gonna still have those expenses in place. So I guess we're gonna look at what you mentioned on page 13 to fill that gap, those, the capital reserve vote and things like that.
So, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Gates, so basically what happens is, you're allowed, there's a lot of leeway in how you use those funds. So basically, we use them in two ways, to offset expenditures, and also to help us fund our reserves. The funding of the reserves is an indirect kind of silver lining to this process. So obviously, when the federal funds run out and we still have these expenses, you're not gonna be able to fund the reserves as much as we were over the last 5 years. And that's when I talked about the peaks and valleys. So that's when we're gonna be heading toward the valleys, and you'll see our reserves, the balances kind of dwindle a bit until we come out of that differential, and then we can start funding them again. So yeah, so to answer your question, that's kind of how it kind of offsets. But yeah, we're not gonna count on money we don't have, or revenue we don't have. I don't like using the word money.
And my last question is, you mentioned adding a budget line for capital
That's the,
improvements.
yeah, so it's called a capital transfer budget line. We did it in my former district. That's the accounting term for it, so I'm not gonna pretend to the board that I know why it's called a capital transfer budget line, but I know what it is. So basically, in my former district, and I don't wanna be inaccurate in my statement, but about 2 years ago, they incorporated a capital improvement line, and we had it in my former school districts. And basically, it allows a school district to spend a certain amount of your budget on capital improvements. Because again, it's a revenue source. So you don't want to be over-ambitious or spend too much on an annual basis, but you want to spend some money so that if unforeseen things happen, or generate that state aid, down the line over 15 years. So my former school districts, basically, and I'm not saying this is going to be our practice, but I just want to give you a point of reference of how it worked. If, we allocated $1 million for this capital transfer line, and we used $750,000 throughout the course of the year, we can say, hey, what else do we need during the course of the year that we can, engage in these projects? I'll give you specifics for our school districts. For example, one of the things we're really looking at is to create more of an equitable space for our female athletes. The male athletes have a varsity locker room and another locker room. Our female athletes don't have the same thing. It'd be great to kind of redesign our locker rooms and the office where our athletic trainer is situated, to move ice machines. Those are those little capital improvements that aren't so little when you look at the costs associated with it. So you really can't do those things within our facilities budget. So that's why you would want sort of a capital improvement transfer line. Because if it costs, a certain amount, then we can maybe capture a project like that using a line like that.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Vice President Hayes.
Wow, what a difference the year has made, because I'm thinking back to sitting up here a year ago, and I'm glad for this year, because it's given time to evaluate really where we are on a fiscal basis, and to determine how we're going to deal with the challenge that we knew we had. And by listening to you tonight, there are ways that this challenge is going to be met with regard to the idea of like the Energia contract that will generate some money coming in, the use of our capital reserve that we got approval for just a few months ago. And in addition, the changes that have been made internally, one of the things that the board was so insistent upon last spring was looking into all of our third-party consultant advisors, and there have been some big changes made there, in particular the new financial advisor who's come on board, and from listening to your presentation, has had a lot of input in this process this year. So that's a new thing, and we're getting the benefit of that. We also implemented, with the help of our council and our bond council, to have additional procedures followed any time that we're going to be doing borrowing, because the board did not want to get into the position that we saw, from 12, 15 years ago. And that's gone into place. And while, these are things that are not visible, but they're making a huge difference to how the district is able to go forward and operate, and how the board can have confidence that things are being met. In addition, the overall challenge that we and all school districts have is, I'll call it the tax cap challenge, which is a state law that is not helpful to us in terms of being able to do the budget planning and to really drive the district forward the way we need to. And I think in the changes that need to be made in Albany, with the assistance of the Nassau-Suffolk School Boards Association and the New York State School Boards Association, and the lobbying efforts they're making, hopefully during our lifetimes, we're going to see some change there that will make your job a little bit easier going forward, Ms. Segee. So we'll look forward to doing that. And the other thing is the benefit of the year and having the new set of eyes come in and go forward is I have a level of comfort here that we're actually able to kind of put a number on the differential between the bond payments and the state aid that we're getting in. And that gives comfort, not because it's necessarily good news, but at least we know what it is. And if we know what it is, we know that you'll find a way to guide us through it so we can deal with it. So I have a level of comfort here and feeling a bit uplifted after hearing your presentation. And I thank you for all the work that went into the presentation and to your presentation itself, because you've got this unique ability to explain things in terms that we can understand. So thank you.
I appreciate that, Trustee Hayes. I also want to give credit to my entire cabinet, Mr. Doyle, Mr. Briggs, because we did dress rehearsals. No, but it was a good process, because you want to get those hard questions, and you want to anticipate questions, and you want to make sure you cover bases. I think going back to our seventh consideration that we make as an administrative team, it really is to earn the confidence of the Board of Trustees, and I don't want to say more important, but really important, the trust of the community. And I think the way you accomplish that by being honest and just being forthcoming. And again, I don't make no mistake, it's not easy work, but it's work we enjoy. And we'll often call each other on the weekends and we discuss things, but we're kind of inspired by it. And we all feel like college freshmen. It's challenging and hard at the same time, but a whole lot of fun.
That concludes your remarks?
It does?
Okay. Well, I think the process for this budget started with our search for a superintendent last year. We were looking for someone who was going to be forward-thinking, who was interested in transparency and helping us rebuild confidence in the community. And I believe you accomplished that here tonight. That's not to say that it's without challenges going forward. And I'm grateful that you recognize those challenges and put them to print and put it right out there so that we can look at them as a team. I like that you honored and recognized the stakeholders, not only the Board of Education, not only our staff, but the community. Because we often get feedback. You even mentioned that about feedback that the Board of Trustees receives to share with you. And Board of Trustees members have received feedback from the community about deteriorating buildings, roof leaks, auditoriums. There's a number of issues out there that we could address. And I don't recall that it's ever been presented in quite the way that you presented it tonight as to how we have to spend money to make money, and then we're protecting our infrastructure and giving our students an environment that's conducive to learning. So for that I'm grateful. I'm also grateful, as a number of people have already mentioned, and Vice President Hayes also mentioned, about taking the advice of our advisors, changing those advisors when they gave us bad advice or not optimal advice. One of those is the 5-year plan. Last year, when we entered into a crisis, I believe the crisis was exacerbated by making a 10-year projection. Because as you stated in the beginning of your presentation, we don't know what the state aid is going to be for this year. How are we going to know what it's going to be for the next 10 years? And that's often difficult, a difficult position that schools are put in, school boards are put in, because we have to start this process before we know. And so, as you said, budgets are our best guess. And being mindful of staying within the confines of what we accomplished last year, and not going over and above, budgeting just a little cushion there for contingencies, but being mindful of this is taxpayer dollars. So you hit all of those points, and I'm grateful for the next step. One item that we all experienced last night, yourself, Vice President Hayes, and me, is we went to a concert for our intermediate school, Frank P. Long, because they don't have a concert venue big enough in their school to accommodate. So they always have their concert at Bellport Middle School, which should have been big enough, and it was standing room only. There were so many people in attendance that there were not enough seats for everyone in attendance. And I think that's a remarkable achievement. I mean, it was uncomfortable for those who had to stand, but they were watching their family members perform, so I'm sure they didn't mind all that much. But I'd like to also look at what our enrollment numbers are. We haven't talked about those in a while. So perhaps we can incorporate that going forward. Is our enrollment the reason that we had such a large capacity there? I don't know. So I'm just throwing that
Enrollment
out.
numbers will be a part of, I could refer back to the schedule, but I think that was either end of February, early March, when we
Okay,
talk
good.
about actual enrollment numbers.
Okay.
To give you a general answer, and I don't want to be quoted because this is, I know enrollment's a tad bit down. We're just under 4,000 students district-wide. I think when I was first researching the district, we were just above 4,000 students, about 4,004 from what I recall. Again, don't quote me on that number. I don't know if my memory is serving me well. But I'm hoping, and listen, last night was really incredible because what I've noticed when I visit buildings, and I've pretty much been at events at each of the buildings, is the outpouring of community support. It's fantastic. It really does feel like a family here. And that's why I decided to come to this district. I know you guys are searching for a superintendent. I was not searching for a district to be a superintendent in. But like I said, when I saw that brochure, and when I read up on the school district, it was just a gut feeling. And I'm happy to be here. And I really want to promote the district. We have so many great things happening. I want people to come out, and see all those great things. And again, the budget process is really impactful because we want to make sure we keep those things going. But being mindful of the fact that there is a differential. The one thing we can't predict, and it's not even a prediction, is the differential that's going to exist for the next 5 years. It's there. That's not going to change. However, we'll get through it. Full confidence in Mr. Gee, my administrative team, all the resources we use to help us get through it. And in reality, we have to do it 1 year at a time. So we're going to focus on 23-24 right now, keeping that projection in mind.
And you've helped raise a level of confidence that I know I feel, and I believe it's felt around the horseshoe here tonight. Because there were times when we didn't feel confident in the numbers that were coming out from our business office. And that has all changed tonight. And my compliments to the entire cabinet, because I know they've been working with you as a team, and you have been able to grow your team and develop your team that works, best for this district, and it was very evident tonight. So thank you very much for all the contributions that the three of you have also made. And we look forward to more of the presentation as we move on.
Try to make it as pretty as possible. The last thing I want to say is there's an inherent mistake in sugarcoating things. You have to be honest. And that's what real progress calls for. And this weekend, I was part of a professional development through my organization. We talked about brave spaces and the idea that sometimes you have to have uncomfortable conversations in order for progress to occur. And you have my pledge that I'm always looking for what's coming, good or bad. And that's how we progress, and that's how we move forward, through honesty and hard work. Thank you all.
Thank you very much. That brings us to the conclusion of our meeting. Motion for executive session. Yeah. So last on the agenda, and as we have stated in the beginning, we will be going into executive session. We will not come back into public portion to close the meeting because we know there will not be any business items to vote on in public. So, having said that, the board will consider a motion to enter into executive session to receive and discuss contract negotiations with CACA, CAA, and SCGA, and to receive advice of counsel. Is there a motion and a second? Motion by Trustee Trent, seconded by Trustee Flippin. All those in favor? With all hands raised, the motion is passed unanimously. Thank you, everyone, for attending tonight and for being a part of our first budget presentation.